Hello, today is July 28th, 2021, and thank you for joining me for another edition of the Market Commentator Podcast. My name is Andy Willms, and I am the President and CEO of the Milwaukee Company. And joining me this morning is Peter Smiley, who is a tax and estate planning attorney with Guth O'Leary Law Firm. Today, Peter and I will be discussing IRS-approved ways you can lower taxes on your investment profits. But before we get started, please keep in mind that this podcast is for informational purposes only, and that the views expressed in today's podcast are Pete and my personal views and not necessarily those of the Milwaukee Company. And with that, welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, glad to have you back. As you know, the U.S. stock market closed the first half of 2021 near record highs. The S&P 500 ended the second quarter of the year up over 14%, which is well above its long-term average of roughly 10.5%. And smaller and mid-cap stocks have also posted impressive results, with the Russell Microcap Index up about 30% and the Russell 2000 up about 17.5% year to date. And so given these stellar returns, investors are facing large looming tax bills. Given that, I thought it would be helpful to get some of your ideas or your thoughts on ways investors can lower taxes on their investment returns without running the risk of raising the ire of the IRS.
Absolutely. I know it's one of those rare occasions where tax preparers kind of dread the up markets because you get these big gains that we get to tell people the bad news in April.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can do some help our listeners do some planning today that'll help keep those taxes lower, the tax bite that they have to pay in April somewhat less. Let's start by talking about a strategy that has received a lot of attention in the media as of late. As I understand it, it works like this. Rather than sell an appreciated asset or security, the investor borrows funds that are needed for whatever purpose. Can you explain how this saves taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. So because you're not selling your appreciated asset, your asset, there's no taxable realization event, meaning that you're effectively deferring the tax on that sale and getting the funds you need somewhere else. It is something that also can be helpful for holding on to assets that are very appreciated, where at the current moment we have a basis step up on death, so that if someone passes away and those assets are includable in their estate, their heirs get to inherit those assets with all the capital gains on that asset removed.
I get it. So they get they get a fair market basis at the date of death. So if they bought let's say I bought a stock, I paid $100 for it, and it's worth $1,000 when I die, and I pass that share of stock on to my son Jake, who's a member of the Milwaukee Company. He could turn around and sell it for $1,000 without paying any taxes, because his basis would be deemed to be what it was worth when I died. Is that how it works?
Exactly.
Okay, good. Well, that sounds pretty straightforward then. Just borrow the money, don't sell the stock, and let your heirs sell the stock and pay off the debt when you die. What could go wrong with that?
Well, the big question right now that we're all waiting on pins and needles for is what the current administration is going to do about this basis step up. The president and previously the Obama administration have both said a number of times that they want to get rid of this. The question of whether or not they have the ability to do that's a whole different discussion, or whether or not they're going to have the votes to do it. But there's certainly the desire out there. And the other thing is that, the reason that this strategy works so well of borrowing against these, or borrowing money instead of investing, is because of the currently low interest rate market. That's no guarantee that that'll continue either.
Right. And I know there's been a lot of talk about repealing the basis step up for some time. And maybe this will happen, but it's tried a long time. It's been tried for a number of times in the past, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see if they can pull it off at this point in time. But it's also important, I think, for listeners to recognize that when you borrow money like this, and you're using the securities that you own as collateral, that you're really this is really just the equivalent of buying stocks on margin. And as we all know, when you buy stocks on margin, when you borrow money to buy stocks, that can really magnify your losses if the value of this, if the margin security loses value. So it's not without its risks, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to the second idea. And we're talking about losses. Let's talk about tax loss harvesting. This is a very popular way of kind of minimizing capital gain tax liabilities. How does that one work?
All right. So this is when you you do actually pick a loser, or you have a stock that's gone down in value. You can sell that asset at a loss and use that loss to offset other gains you might have either this year or in the future. It's important to remember that not only does that mean that you can offset other gains. So if you sold a stock for a loss and you had $100 a loss on that, you can apply that against $100 a gain this year. But if you didn't have that gain this year, you sold for a big loss, you can actually carry that forward to next year and apply it against your gains for that year as well. And because short-term gains are generally taxed at, well, are always taxed at a higher rate than long-term gains, this works really well for those short-term losses. So you bought in for whatever company, and it turns out that was a dud. That's the time to sell it when it's short term, because then you get to have those short-term losses offset first.
Got it. And I'm a big time fan of capital gain harvest, capital loss harvesting, and use it with my clients, all the time. But there's an important limitation on it that our listeners need to be aware of.
Yeah, there's a couple of limitations that are really important. The first one is that if you have a loss and it's over, you have a loss for the year, you only can take $3,000 of that loss this year. And if you have a loss next year, you can only take $3,000 that year too. So until you have gains to apply that loss against, oftentimes it can really hamstring you into a losing year where you don't get the full deduction of your loss. The other thing to keep in mind is there's ordering rules for how losses are allocated. So basically, if you have a lot of long-term losses and you make some short-term gains, your long-term losses will apply first against long-term gains, which means you may not get the full benefit of that, the carry-forward losses.
Right, and just to clarify your earlier point,
yeah.
When you say there's a limit of $3,000 of that you can take against use in the year of the loss, you mean I think you're referring to the amount of ordinary income, earnings and things like that, non-capital gains. There's no limit as to how much capital gains you can offset with capital losses in the year in which the losses incurred.
Exactly, and it's something where if you had $1 million loss and you made $1 million that year, you could offset that entire amount. But if you had $1 million,
you made $1 million in capital gain.
Right, capital gains.
I've got to be careful.
And yep, absolutely.
Okay, and there's one more thing that I want to make sure our listeners are aware of, and that is if you sell a security and recognize a loss, and you have to wait at least 30 days to repurchase that security that you sold at a loss, or the loss is wiped out. So there's this 30-day rule that you have to abide by. But
absolutely, the dreaded wash sale.
Yeah, the wash sale rules, but the 30-day rule doesn't apply to ETFs so long as the ETFs that you buy are not the one that you sold and the one you bought are not identical. So it's a very common thing to sell an ETF at a loss and buy a very, very similar ETF, and that does not trigger a loss sale rule. Now, you probably don't want to be overly aggressive with this, and you probably want to pick two ETFs that maybe follow very similar but not identical indexes. If you're going to sell an S&P 500 index fund to recognize a loss, I probably would look at a different ETF that tracks a different index, at least for that 30-day period. But it works extremely well with ETFs. And one of the many benefits associated with investing in ETFs, in my opinion, as compared to, let's say, individual securities. Do I have that right, Pete?
Absolutely. And it's something that I know that as a tax preparer, we answer that question all the time for investors. They'll tell us what assets they're selling and buying, and we'll be able to give them some direction then.
Yeah, exactly. And while we normally don't recommend our clients harvest capital gains, this year might be a reason, might be different, right? You may actually want to not only harvest capital losses, you may actually want to harvest capital gains this year. Pete,
Absolutely.
and
So
why? Well, let's talk about that a bit.
absolutely. So traditionally, the goal is to defer payment of taxes as long as you're able to. I mean, that's been kind of a mantra in the tax planning community for the past, however many years. But this year, we're actually starting to worry about tax rates going up in the future. Now, capital gains have been treated very, very favorably over the past, 50 years in this country, but it's something that President Biden has indicated he wants to raise the capital gains rates. It's something that's gotten a lot of press recently. So a lot of people are looking at this saying, maybe this is the year we should just realize it and pay a lower rate than we would if I realized it next year at the same income level.
Yep. And it's a special, I agree, and something we're talking to our clients about. And it's especially problematic or a concern, I should say, for very high income earners, because at this point, the focus is on raising capital gains for high income taxpayers. But, once that door is open, who knows how low they would go. So it's a good year to consider harvesting capital gains as well as capital losses. I'd also like to talk, Pete, a little bit about, we were talking about ETFs a moment ago. I'd like to bring up, another tax advantage of index tracking ETFs, which, as you know, is the Milwaukee Company's preferred investment vehicle. When we talk about index funds versus individual securities or actively managed funds, most people focus on the lower fees and performance advantage historically enjoyed by index funds. However, index funds have a significant tax advantage as well. And we can see that Morningstar publishes what's called their tax cost ratio, which is a measure of the reduction in the returns from taxes on fund distributions. And that is averaged about 1.8% for equity, higher for equity funds than index funds. And in their report, Morningstar points out that the return hit from taxes is nearly twice as large as that from annual expenses. Well, what I'm pointing out, or trying to explain here, I guess, is that, with typical mutual funds, you have to pay income taxes on the distributions those funds make to the fund investors. With ETFs, if they track a broad index and they're widely, large ETFs, typically the only time you're going to pay taxes is when you sell the ETF shares you own. So that can be a big plus for investors. And, if you think about it, the U.S. stock market's average return has been about 10% historically. So saving nearly about 1.8% in the terms of return by tax advantages, that represents about a 20% uptick for the ETFs as compared to the actively managed funds.
Yeah, anything that's tax efficiency is always an important thing for investors to keep their eyes on.
One more thing I'd like to talk about, Pete, is some news of late that venture capitalist Peter Thiel has been able to accumulate more than $5 billion in his Roth IRA, where it will be entirely tax-free to him. Can you give us a rundown of what happened here? How did he manage to get $5 billion tax-free in his Roth IRA?
Oh yeah, I'll tell you, that's the tax planner's dreams right there. So basically, contributions to Roth IRAs are not tax deductible, and distributions from Roths are tax-free because you're paying the tax as you put it into the Roth. So that means that the capital gains on assets held in a Roth IRA aren't taxed once you make the contribution. So when Congress created the Roth IRA, they did it to help middle-class earners put aside money for retirement. pay the tax now, and that way they can get, the government gets their money now, and people get to grow the money tax-free for the rest of their lives. As a result, there's pretty stringent limits on contributions to IRAs because obviously this would be rife for abuse if someone could do that. So if you are under 50, you can only contribute $6,000 a year to your Roth, and if you're 51 or over, that goes up to $7,000. There's also taxable limits for direct contributions. For single people, that's $124,000 of adjusted gross income effectively, and $196,000 for married couples. So you see that there's actually a little bit of a penalty for married couples on that too. So they're set up to make this very flexible for people to save, but not meant to be saving this large amounts of money.
Well, then, given these limits, how the heck was Mr. Thiel able to get $5 billion in his Roth?
Well, actually, so he was a co-founder of PayPal and used his Roth to buy PayPal stock when it was worth pennies. Well, today it's worth $5 billion, and if he sells the stock in his IRA, in his Roth IRA, there's not going to be any tax due on that. And once he turns 59 and a half, he can start withdrawing those proceeds tax-free with penalty-free.
Well, that's quite an accomplishment. But I want to also point out to our listeners that anybody can convert a traditional IRA to Roth IRAs. There's no income limits or anything like that. So if you have a traditional IRA, you might want to look at converting it to a Roth IRA. Now, it's true, the conversion is taxable. But once the amount's converted, distributions, you pay that tax up front. Future distributions from the Roth are, again, entirely tax-free. So if you come across an investment that you think has the potential for massive gains and the investment is appropriate for a Roth IRA to own, you may want to consider making that investment inside a Roth IRA.
And also, regarding those conversions, it's also been very valuable for people who think that the tax rate that they're going to be looking at next year or in the next coming years is going to be higher than it currently is for them. So if you see taxes going up in the future for you, this is a conversation that you really should have with somebody, at least to see if it fits what your plans are.
Yeah, well, and I couldn't agree with you more. I've been preaching the advantages of Roth IRAs since they were first enacted into the tax code a couple of decades ago. I wrote an article about it way back then, and I still am a strong believer.
I know. It's a mutually shared respect for the Roth here. So
you're absolutely right. Pete, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. There's a lot more we could always talk about, but I want to thank you for joining and thank all of our listeners for tuning in. Please keep in mind that you should conduct your own independent research before acting on any information or opinions expressed during this podcast, and that you should not act on anything you heard in the podcast until you have discussed it with a qualified financial professional who's familiar with your personal situation and your investment objectives. And with that, I'll say thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be a solicitation, offering, or recommendation of any security, commodity, derivative, investment management service, or advisory service. Nothing in this podcast constitutes or should be understood as constituting a recommendation to enter in any securities transactions or to engage in any of the investment strategies discussed. Viewers should consult with an independent financial professional or independently research and verify information presented in this podcast before acting on it.